Thinking Out Loud with Dave Palmer. Here on Morning Joy, where truth matters.
Welcome back to Morning Joy, where truth matters. I am your host, Keith Downey, and we're going to be talking with Dave Palmer on Thinking Out Loud and talking obviously, this whole month is about Mary, but what does St. Thomas Aquinas have to say? Good morning, Dave.
Good morning, Keith. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for asking. Now, you probably heard it from Debbie. She was basically preempting here. What is the one word that describes Mary for you?
All right. Well, I had a little time to prepare this, and I haven't listened to the whole show yet. So I hope my word hasn't been taken yet. But in light of the fact that we're going to talk about the Immaculate Conception, I'm going to say immaculate. Has that been taken yet?
I don't believe so. I think that's the first time this morning. It's a great segue too about what St. Thomas Aquinas would describe her as.
Yeah, because, if you asked your kid to go take a bath and get clean is different from immaculate. Immaculate just means spotless. I mean, none of us probably are immaculate because there's always a little bit of a stain. So I think immaculate kind of lifts up that purity and that cleanliness and that holiness to another level. So that's officially my word. And I also have my rosary here. Okay.
Nice.
I'm covering all the bases. I see Tim's.
Well, yeah. So what did St. Thomas Aquinas have to say about Mary? Specifically, you mentioned the Immaculate Conception.
Yeah, the Immaculate Conception, I think, is one of the most, it's a very fascinating part of the Summa, because if people know about the Summa, and first of all, St. Thomas Aquinas places almost all of his teachings on the Blessed Mother in the section on the Incarnation, okay? So she's linked to Jesus Christ in the Incarnation, obviously, because without her, there would not, she was the vessel through which the Incarnation happened, right? And so and there's quite a bit. And, we can maybe next week cover some more about the Blessed Mother. But as far as the Immaculate Conception itself, I think if somebody knows a little bit about the Summa, they might be inclined to say, well, that's something that St. Thomas Aquinas got wrong, right? He didn't get it. He didn't get it right. And in a sense, you'd be right, because he did ask that question very specifically about whether Mary was sanctified at the moment of her conception. And he said no. And so in that regard, it's wrong. But you also have to keep in mind that the dogma of the Immaculate Conception didn't come until 1858, Pope Pius IX. And so Thomas is writing in the 1200s, and the dogma comes, 600 years later, if I have my math right. And so he wasn't wrong in the sense of being disobedient to the church, or, the church has proclaimed one way, and he's like, oh, I don't think so. That wasn't the case. But he just taking the information that he had and also trying to kind of, in his mind, guard the dignity of Jesus Christ. He didn't want to give her the same privileges as he did Jesus, because in another article of the Summa, he says, was Jesus Christ sanctified at the moment of his conception? And he says yes. And so that was the whole thing. And that's how he explains it, is that he didn't want to be derogatory towards Christ by giving the Blessed Mother the exact same privilege as he did Jesus. And so did he get it wrong? Yes and no.
So that you raise a good point, that was his belief, obviously 600 years before it went into dogma there. But was that kind of the same vibe that people in that age also believed, or was it kind of a mixture? Do you know?
Yeah, well, that's a good point, because the next, not too long after Aquinas, a guy named Duns Scotus came along, who's a Franciscan, and he's the one who kind of came up with the formula. It wouldn't be too much of a stretch other than to say, hey, how about if we give her the same privilege that, Jesus had at his conception in being sanctified? But if officially, he's the one who kind of formulated it. So I think there must have been some debate back then, but of course, back then, Aquinas was kind of like the gold standard, and so, but I think he also would have been taking information from the other church fathers, from Augustine and Jerome and Damascene and these kind of people as well. And so if you dig into the Summa and look at that section, he starts off by saying, was the Blessed Mother sanctified in the womb? Okay, so in that 9-month period when she was inside her mother's womb, right? And Thomas says, yes. He says, well, it happened to others. It happened to John the Baptist. It happened to Jeremiah. So certainly that privilege would be given to the Blessed Mother as well. And then he says, well, what about before conception? And then he says, no, that couldn't happen because before conception, you're not even a human being. You're not subject to sin. So there wouldn't be any point of being sanctified before conception. So then it was that question of, right, what about the very moment of conception? And that's where he came down and said, no, it would have been afterwards because, that's what Jesus Christ got, right? So that's where he came down on it. But one interesting thing is at the end of his life, he said, with regard to everything that I've written, I leave it to the Catholic Church to correct whatever I got wrong. So he had a great sense of humility, and he would have been the first one in 1854 when Pius IX dogmatized the Immaculate Conception to say, okay, yep, that's right. I didn't get that one exactly right. So I think he had a great sense of humility about him.
I was just about to say, I mean, that's a great thing that he did, that it like, hey, if any of this is wrong, the Catholic Church, please correct me, because I was just about to say, does this, him having this incorrect view of the Immaculate Conception make him less credible, especially when it comes to, trying to convert Protestants who don't have that same view of Mary? But it seems not, because he kind of left it up for the church to correct him.
Yeah, I know you and I had a conversation recently, Keith. We were talking about Father Donald Calloway. I heard him say that he thinks that the church will at one point dogmatize that Saint Joseph was assumed into heaven, okay, that he was miraculously assumed. And, that isn't a dogma yet. And so, you and I can have this conversation, and I don't have necessarily an opinion on it one way or the other, but just for, argument's sake, let's say I say, oh, I don't think that's the case for A, B, C, and D. I think that's a privilege that was reserved for the Blessed Mother. And then let's say next year the church comes and dogmatizes it, and Pope Francis says, yes, Joseph was assumed into heaven. Well, at that moment, I changed my mind, right? Because I'm going to trust. So I think in some sense, it's a great question. I think in some sense, it gives even more credibility to St. Thomas Aquinas because, we really want to approach the teachings of the church with a sense of humility. And we want to be able to, never think that we can ever say anything because it may be wrong and we might not speculate on this or that. But as soon as we hear that this is something that the church has defined, the church has decided on, well, we need to agree with them because they got a whole lot more. The church has a whole lot more wisdom than we do, Yeah. And Keith, if I may throw in also one of the interesting things, because if somebody after 1854, when the dogma was declared by Pius IX, we're still like, I don't know, I disagree. I think Aquinas was right. In 1858, it's when Our Lady appeared to Saint Bernadette at Lourdes. And if you study those conversations that Our Lady and Bernadette had, Our Lady never identifies herself as the Blessed Mother or as Mary. Bernadette calls her, the lady. I saw the lady. And then when she finally kind of gets pressed, who are you? The Blessed Mother says, I am the Immaculate Conception. And so the timing of that is interesting, because it's almost like if anybody is going to have any doubts and they don't think that this privilege was given to our Blessed Mother the same as it was Jesus, well, then God sends our Lady down 4 years later after the dogma to kind of like give that divine stamp of approval. And I just think the timing of God is so amazing.
Oh, absolutely. And I loved how you framed it. Yeah, the heavenly stamp of approval for this particular dogma. I mean, if Our Lady says it, then, hey, how can we argue against it? Is there anything else that St. Thomas Aquinas got incorrect, or I don't want to say incorrect, but maybe wasn't approved at that point in time until later in the church?
Yeah, there are other things. I'm trying to think of something right off the top of my head. There's a lot of kind of like scientific stuff. I wouldn't say a lot. There's some because he was relying on a lot of science that goes, back to like Aristotle, because there wasn't a whole lot of scientific progress, be in the first, let's say 1200 years of the church or so. A lot of that came afterwards with, Newton and so I think that if you read some parts of it, you might say that some of the science is wrong. But the Summa is not a scientific textbook. You're not going to read this in biology class. It's more for metaphysics, it's for philosophy and for theology. And so I'd say for 95% of it, he did get it right.
Got it. And are there any other, aside from the Summa, which is obviously the big book here that we always talk and go to for your segment, is there any other resource we can dive into that maybe talks a little bit more about the Immaculate Conception?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm sure, of course, you can always, go on YouTube and find 100 videos. And, if it's a trusted source, if it's, Catholic Answers or, something like that, you know that it's going to be trustworthy. As far as books or any, specific resources, I can't think of anything offhand. But if Keith, you're really ambitious and you want to go and read the encyclical itself, it was actually it's a constitution called Ineffabilis Deus. And again, Pius IX pronounced and defined that the Blessed Virgin Mary, in the first instance of her conception, by a singular privilege of grace granted by God in view of the merits of Jesus Christ, the Savior of the human race, was preserved exempt from all stain of original sin. That is such a beautiful sentence.
Wow.
He packs in so much because she is still dependent upon the merit of Jesus Christ. It's still a singular grace. So I would suggest, if people feel ambitious, go read that Constitution and the actual words of the Pope. And then there certainly would be some other resources and some videos if they want to dig deeper into it.
That's a great point you mentioned. I think as Catholics, obviously the Bible is important to read. Catechism is also important to read, but also some of these documents that the previous popes have come out. It's always good to I don't know, just kind of learn about our history, and obviously that falls into what our popes have given us. My goodness. Thank you so much, Dave Palmer, for giving us a little lesson about St. Thomas Aquinas and the Immaculate Conception. We really, really appreciate that.
Thanks, Keith. It's good to be with you. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, hey, we can also catch you on Back to the Father every Friday at 1 p.m. Central on GRN Online YouTube. And coming up tomorrow on Morning Joy, Sissel Anderson gets back from her vacation and returns for her Fruitful Living segment. Really excited for that. But other than that, this is the end of our first hour. Obviously, we'd love to thank you, for those who are listening that might be, arriving at their final destination, perhaps at school, work, or maybe Holy Mass. As always, pray for us if it's Holy Mass, please. But we got a lot coming up on our second hour. We'll be talking about how we can evangelize and convert our friends with the help of Mary. You want to stay tuned. We'll see you right after this break.
This has been Morning Joy, where truth matters, hosted by Keith Downey. Take some joy with you today. Visit grnonline.com/joy to listen again, share a segment, or answer the question of the day. That's grnonline.com/joy.